The way my son David's wife Charlotte dismissed me with barely concealed disgust, telling me I was too old and wrinkled to be in their family Christmas photos, told me everything I needed to know about my place in their perfect little world. I smiled politely and stepped aside like the gracious mother I'd always tried to be, but beneath that forced smile, something inside me finally snapped. I just never imagined how quickly their picture-perfect life would come crashing down, or how desperately they'd come begging when they discovered I owned something they desperately needed. My name is Grace, and this is the story of how I went from being the embarrassing mother-in-law to the one holding all the cards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Grace Thompson, and for 32 years, I worked as a high school English teacher in the small town of Millbrook. I wasn't wealthy by any means, but I was careful with my money, lived modestly, and had always believed that character mattered more than appearance or status. At 63, I had silver hair that I wore proudly, laugh lines that told the story of a life well lived, and the kind of practical wardrobe that comes from decades of prioritizing substance over style. I never thought those things would make me unworthy of being in a photograph with my own family. David had always been the center of my world. After his father died in a car accident when David was just 12, it became just the two of us against everything life could throw our way. I worked extra tutoring sessions to afford his baseball equipment, took on summer school teaching to pay for his college prep courses, and stretched every dollar to make sure he never felt like he was missing out because we didn't have much money. When he graduated from college debt-free and landed a good job at a marketing firm in the city, I felt like every sacrifice had been worth it. He was 28 when he met Charlotte Davis at some corporate networking event. She was everything I wasn't: tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. She worked in public relations for a luxury hotel chain and carried herself like someone who belonged, in magazine spreads rather than small-town family gatherings. From our very first meeting at an upscale restaurant I could barely afford, I could feel her evaluating me. My department store dress, my practical shoes, my simple jewelry, nothing about me met whatever standard she had in mind for her future mother-in-law. "David has told me so much about you," she said that first evening, extending a perfectly manicured hand, while her eyes took inventory of everything from my outdated purse to my drugstore lipstick. It must have been so challenging, raising him, alone on a teacher's salary. "You've done remarkably well, considering the circumstances." The way she said, "considering the circumstances," made it sound like I'd been working with some kind of severe disadvantage, as if loving my son and providing him a stable home wasn't enough because it hadn't come wrapped in designer packaging. But I smiled and nodded, determined to like the woman my son had chosen, even if she seemed determined not to like me. Their engagement was announced 6 months later with a ring that probably cost more than my annual salary. The wedding was planned for the following summer at Charlotte's family estate, a sprawling property with manicured gardens and the kind of old-money elegance that made my modest apartment feel like a closet. When I offered to contribute what I could to the wedding costs, Charlotte's mother, Amelia, waved me off with a patronizing smile. "Oh, Grace, that's so sweet of you to offer, but we have everything handled. We want Charlotte to have the wedding she's always dreamed of, and we're fortunate enough to be able to provide that." The message was clear. My contribution wasn't needed because my contribution wouldn't be significant enough to matter. I was being politely but firmly told to stay in my lane, which apparently was nowhere near the planning of my own son's wedding. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of elegant excess. Hundreds of white roses, a string quartet, Charlotte floating down the aisle in a custom gown that probably cost more than my car. I wore a navy blue dress I'd found on sale and had my hair done at the local salon where I'd been going for 15 years. When I arrived for pre-ceremony photos, Charlotte's photographer was already capturing her with her bridesmaids, her parents, her grandparents, her aunts and uncles. Everyone but me. We're just doing a few quick family shots, Charlotte explained, when I approached, not quite meeting my eyes. We'll get some with you later at the reception. Later never came. Throughout the entire reception, every time I approached for a photo, there was always a reason why it wasn't the right moment. The photographer was packing up. Charlotte needed to touch up her makeup. They were running behind schedule for the cake cutting. By the end of the night, I had exactly 0 photos with my son on his wedding day, a fact that stung more than I wanted to admit. But that was just the beginning. After they returned from their honeymoon in Italy, a trip that lasted 3 weeks and probably cost more than I made in 6 months, the dynamics of our relationship became crystal clear. David, who used to call me twice a week, now went weeks without contact. Sunday dinners, which had been our tradition since he was a teenager, became monthly obligations that Charlotte frequently had last-minute conflicts with. When I did see them, it was always on their terms, in their world, where I was made to feel like a visitor who was being tolerated rather than welcomed. Their new house was a showcase in an exclusive neighborhood where the smallest homes started at $500,000. Everything was white marble and cream carpets, designer furniture that looked beautiful but felt cold and unwelcoming. Not a single photo from David's childhood was displayed anywhere. It was as if his life before Charlotte had been completely erased, replaced by an aesthetic so perfect it felt sterile. "We're going for modern minimalism," Charlotte explained when I commented on the lack of personal touches. "Our interior designer says that too many personal items can make a space feel cluttered and dated." Apparently, evidence of David's childhood qualified as clutter. The photos of his Little League games, his high school graduation, our camping trips to the state park, all of it was too dated for their perfect home. I was being systematically erased from their life, one small exclusion at a time, and David seemed either oblivious to it or unwilling to challenge his wife's increasingly obvious campaign to minimize my presence. The final straw came last Christmas. They invited me to their annual holiday party, a lavish affair with catered food, professional decorations, and Charlotte's circle of perfectly polished friends and colleagues. I arrived bearing homemade cookies, David's childhood favorite, and a thoughtful gift I'd spent weeks selecting. Charlotte accepted both with the kind of smile you give to a persistent door-to-door salesperson. As the evening wound down, Charlotte announced it was time for the annual family Christmas photo. A professional photographer had been hired for the occasion, and everyone gathered around their enormous Christmas tree for what was clearly a carefully orchestrated moment. I moved forward to join the group, assuming that family photo included me, the mother of the man whose house we were standing in. That's when Charlotte said the words that would change everything between us. "Grace, would you mind stepping back? We're trying to maintain a certain aesthetic for these photos, and honestly, you're looking a bit too old and wrinkled for what we're going for. Maybe you could take some candid shots of us instead." The room went silent. David's face flushed, red, but he said nothing. Charlotte's friends looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. I stood there, feeling smaller and more humiliated than I had since I was a child, while the woman my son had married casually dismissed me as too ugly, too old, too unworthy to be included in a family photograph. That's when I realized I was done being the gracious, accommodating mother-in-law who swallowed every insult for the sake of family harmony. Charlotte had just made a very expensive mistake, and she had no idea what was coming next. The humiliation of that Christmas photo incident didn't end when I left their house that night. It followed me home, replayed in my mind for days, and settled into my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. But what hurt more than Charlotte's cruel words was David's silence. My son, the boy I'd raised to stand up for what was right, had said absolutely nothing when his wife publicly humiliated his mother. He'd just stood there, red-faced and uncomfortable, but ultimately complicit in my degradation. I spent the next few days analyzing every interaction I'd had with Charlotte over the past 2 years, looking for signs I'd somehow missed or misinterpreted. But the pattern was unmistakable. From that very first dinner when she'd evaluated my appearance like a judge at a livestock show, to the systematic exclusion from wedding photos, to the gradual erasure of my presence from David's life, it had all been leading to this moment. Charlotte hadn't just married my son, she'd launched a campaign to remove me from the picture, and what made it worse was how carefully orchestrated it all was. Charlotte was far too smart to outright ban me from their lives or make obviously cruel demands. Instead, she employed a death-by-a-thousand-cuts approach. The delayed invitations that arrived too late for me to attend events. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The family gatherings, scheduled during times she knew I had teaching obligations. The casual comments about how tired I looked, how dated my clothes were, how much more energy younger people had. Each incident was small enough to seem accidental or innocent, but together, they painted a clear picture of someone working methodically to push me to the margins. David, for his part, had become a stranger to me. The boy who used to tell me everything about his day now shared nothing beyond polite pleasantries. The young man who had once defended his classmates from bullies now watched silently as his own mother was bullied in his living room. Marriage had changed him, but not in the ways I'd hoped. Instead of gaining confidence and maturity, he'd become a people pleaser who would rather avoid conflict than stand up for his principles. "Mom, you have to understand," he'd said the one time I'd tried to address Charlotte's behavior, about 6 months before the photo incident. "Charlotte comes from a different world. Her family has certain expectations about how things should be done, how we should present ourselves. It's important for my career, for our future." "And what about your past?" I'd asked. "What about the woman who raised you, who sacrificed everything to give you opportunities? Do I not matter in this equation?" He'd looked genuinely pained by the question, but his answer had been telling. "Of course you matter, Mom. But you have to admit, compared to Charlotte's family, we didn't have much. She's helping me become the person I always wanted to be." The person he always wanted to be, apparently, was someone who was embarrassed by his origins, someone who saw his modest upbringing as something to overcome rather than something to honor. Charlotte hadn't just married David. She'd convinced him that his entire life before her had been somehow insufficient, something to be improved upon rather than celebrated. This transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process, so subtle that I'm not sure David even realized it was happening. First, Charlotte had introduced him to her social circle, young professionals with expensive tastes and impressive credentials. Then she'd slowly upgraded his wardrobe, his car, his apartment. Each change presented as a gift or a practical necessity. His haircut became more sophisticated, his speech patterns more polished, his interests increasingly aligned with hers. By the time they got engaged, David had developed opinions about wine, art, and interior design that he'd never expressed before. He'd joined Charlotte's gym, started playing tennis at her country club, and begun attending charity galas and networking events that would have bored him to tears just 2 years earlier. It wasn't that these changes were inherently bad. David was entitled to grow and evolve as a person, but the way Charlotte orchestrated these improvements suggested that she saw the David I'd raised as a rough draft that needed extensive editing to be acceptable. The most painful part was watching David internalize Charlotte's assessment of our life together. He began referring to our old traditions, movie nights with homemade popcorn, camping trips to state parks, holiday cookies made from scratch, as simple pleasures or quaint memories. The tone wasn't necessarily dismissive, but it was definitely patronizing, as if these experiences were charming in their naivety, but ultimately something he'd outgrown. When Charlotte's parents visited, David would carefully curate the stories. He shared about his childhood, emphasizing his academic achievements and extracurricular activities, while glossing over the financial struggles and creative solutions that had made those accomplishments possible. He never lied exactly, but he presented a sanitized version of our life that made it sound like we'd been middle-class strivers, rather than a single mother and son making the best of difficult circumstances. The irony was that David's humility, work ethic, and genuine kindness, the qualities that had made Charlotte fall in love with him in the first place, were direct products of our simple life together. His ability to connect with people from all walks of life, his appreciation for small gestures of kindness, his instinct to help others, these weren't accidents. They were the result of being raised by someone who understood that character mattered more than credentials, that love was more valuable than luxury. But Charlotte seemed determined to sand away these rough edges, to transform David into a more polished version of himself that would fit seamlessly into her world. And David, perhaps desperate to prove he belonged in that world, was letting it happen. The saddest part was that I could see glimpses of the real David still there, underneath all the careful improvements. When we were alone together, he would sometimes slip back into old patterns, telling silly jokes, asking about former students, showing genuine interest in my day-to-day life. But the moment Charlotte entered the room, he would shift back into his new persona, the successful professional who happened to have a teacher for a mother, rather than the beloved son of a woman who had given him everything. I'd spent months telling myself that this was just a phase, that David would eventually find his balance and remember who he really was. I'd convinced myself that Charlotte's obvious discomfort with me would fade as she got to know me better, that we could find common ground if I just tried hard enough to be the kind of mother-in-law she could respect. But that Christmas night, as I drove home from their party with Charlotte's words still ringing in my ears, I finally understood the truth. This wasn't a phase that would pass, or a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with better communication. Charlotte had looked at me and seen everything she wanted to erase from David's life: his modest background, his simple upbringing, his connection to a world that didn't match her aesthetic vision of success. And David, the son I'd raised to value substance over style, had stood there and let it happen. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided I wasn't good enough. I was done pretending that Charlotte's behavior was acceptable just to keep peace in the family. And I was definitely done allowing my son to watch while his wife treated me like an embarrassing relic who needed to be hidden away. It was time to remind them both exactly who they were dealing with. The weeks following the Christmas photo incident passed in a blur of forced normalcy. David called 3 days later, his voice carefully casual, as if nothing significant had happened at their party. He made no mention of Charlotte's cruel words, offered no apology for his silence, and seemed determined to pretend the whole thing had been some kind of misunderstanding that we could all just move past. "Thanks for coming to the party, Mom," he said, his tone artificially bright. "Charlotte mentioned you seemed tired that night. Maybe next time you should head home a little earlier. These late-night events can be exhausting." The gaslighting was so smooth, so expertly done, that for a moment I almost doubted my own memory. Had I misheard Charlotte's words? Had I somehow overreacted to what might have been an innocent comment? But then I remembered the stunned silence in that room, the uncomfortable faces of Charlotte's friends, the photographer's awkward attempt to pretend nothing had happened. No, I hadn't imagined it. Charlotte had publicly declared me too old and ugly for their family photos, and David was now trying to rewrite history to make it my fault for being tired. This pattern of revisionist history became Charlotte's specialty over the following months. Every slight was reframed as a misunderstanding. Every exclusion was repositioned as consideration for my comfort or schedule. When I wasn't invited to Charlotte's birthday dinner at an expensive restaurant, David explained that they hadn't wanted to put financial pressure on me. When I found out about David's promotion through a Facebook post rather than a phone call, Charlotte suggested they'd assumed I'd prefer to hear good news in a more casual way rather than being put on the spot with a phone conversation. The most infuriating part was how reasonable these explanations sounded on the surface. Anyone listening would think Charlotte and David were being thoughtful, even protective of my feelings. But I knew better. Each consideration was actually another way of keeping me at arm's length, another excuse to exclude me from meaningful moments in my son's life. The campaign escalated when Charlotte's younger sister Sophia got engaged in February. The engagement party was held at the same country club where David and Charlotte had their wedding reception, and this time I wasn't even invited. I found out about it when I saw photos on social media. David and Charlotte smiling alongside. Sophia and her fiancé, Charlotte's parents beaming with pride, extended family members I'd met at the wedding all gathered together in celebration. When I asked David about it, his explanation was masterful in its cruelty disguised as kindness. "Mom, it was really just immediate family. Charlotte's parents, her grandparents, a few aunts and uncles. We thought you might feel out of place since you don't really know that side of the family well." "I'm your immediate family, David," I reminded him, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm your mother." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Of course you are. I just meant Charlotte's immediate family. It was her sister's party, so her parents were handling the guest list." The message was crystal clear. I was David's family, but I wasn't their family. I was a separate category, someone to be managed and contained rather than included and embraced. Charlotte had successfully created a hierarchy where her family's comfort and preferences took precedence over my relationship with my own son. As spring turned to summer, the exclusions became more systematic and harder to explain away. David's birthday came and went without the usual family dinner I'd been hosting for 28 years. Instead, Charlotte organized a weekend getaway to a luxury resort with just a few close friends. Mother's Day arrived with a generic card and flowers delivered by a service, accompanied by a note explaining that they'd be out of town that weekend for Charlotte's cousin's wedding, another event I hadn't been told about, let alone invited. To each incident chipped away at my sense of belonging in David's life. I began to feel like a stranger being updated on the activities of someone I used to know well. Phone calls became brief and infrequent. Visits to their house were scheduled weeks in advance and felt more like appointments than family time. When I did see them, Charlotte would dominate the conversation with detailed accounts of their social calendar, their home renovation projects, their vacation plans, all activities that I was clearly not expected to be part of. The psychological impact was devastating. I found myself questioning everything about our relationship, wondering if I had somehow failed as a mother, if there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me unworthy of inclusion in my son's new life. I replayed years of conversations, looking for signs of where I'd gone wrong, what I could have done differently to earn Charlotte's approval and maintain David's affection. My colleagues at school began to notice the change in me. Margaret Ellis, who'd been teaching in the classroom next to mine for 15 years, finally confronted me in the faculty lounge one afternoon in late May. "Grace, I don't know what's going on with you lately, but you're not yourself," she said, settling into the chair across from me with her coffee. "You look tired all the time. You're not participating in conversations the way you used to, and yesterday I saw you crying in your car after school. Talk to me." I tried to brush off her concerns, but Margaret had known me too long to be fooled by surface reassurances. Eventually, the whole story came tumbling out. The systematic exclusions, the revised explanations, the growing sense that I was being erased from my son's life by a woman who saw me as an obstacle to her perfect family image. Margaret listened. Without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail I shared. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Grace, What you're describing isn't normal family adjustment. This is deliberate, calculated emotional abuse. Charlotte is isolating David from you, and she's doing it so gradually that he probably doesn't even realize it's happening. Hearing someone else name what I'd been experiencing was both validating and terrifying. It confirmed that I wasn't imagining things or being overly sensitive, but it also forced me to confront the reality that this situation wasn't going to improve on its own. Charlotte wasn't going to suddenly develop affection for me, and David wasn't going to spontaneously recognize what was happening and put a stop to it. What should I do? I asked Margaret, feeling more lost than I had since David's father died. You need to decide how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice, for the sake of keeping peace, she replied. Because right now, you're giving them everything and getting nothing in return. That's not sustainable, and it's not healthy. That conversation marked a turning point in my thinking. I began to see my situation more clearly, to recognize the patterns of manipulation and control that had been so skillfully deployed against me. I also began to understand that my attempts to be accommodating and understanding had actually enabled Charlotte's behavior, showing her that I would accept any level of mistreatment rather than risk losing access to David entirely. But perhaps, most importantly, I began to realize that I had more power in this situation than I'd been acknowledging. Charlotte's campaign against me was working precisely because I'd been cooperating with it, accepting her terms, playing by her rules. What would happen if I stopped doing that? What would happen if I reminded everyone involved exactly who they were dealing with? The answer to that question would come sooner than I expected, and it would change everything. The breaking point came on a sweltering July afternoon when David called with what he presented as wonderful news. His voice had that forced enthusiasm I'd grown to recognize, the tone he used when he was about to deliver information that Charlotte had coached him to share. "Mom, great news. Charlotte's pregnant. We're having a baby." My heart should have soared. This was my first grandchild, the continuation of our family line, a new little person to love unconditionally. But even as joy tried to surface, I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. If Charlotte had been this determined to exclude me when it was just her and David, what would happen when there was a baby involved? How much more marginalized would I become when there was an actual grandchild for her to use as leverage? "That's wonderful, David," I managed, forcing warmth into my voice. "How is Charlotte feeling? When is the baby due?" "She's doing great, just a little morning sickness. Due date is February 15th. We're both so excited." I waited for the invitation that should have come next, to celebrate with them, to discuss plans, to be included in this momentous occasion. Instead, there was an awkward pause. "We're having a little announcement party this Saturday," David finally continued. "Nothing fancy, just immediate family and a few close friends. Charlotte's handling all the arrangements." The phrase "immediate family" hit me like a physical blow. I knew exactly what it meant in Charlotte's vocabulary, and it didn't include me. "That sounds lovely," I said carefully. "What time should I be there?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Actually, Mom, Charlotte's really overwhelmed with the party planning right now, and her family is flying in from out of state. She's worried about having too many people." "Too many people," I repeated slowly. "At your baby announcement, your first child." "It's not that we don't want you there," David said quickly, his voice taking on that pleading tone he used when he knew he was asking me to accept something unacceptable. "It's just that Charlotte's really stressed about managing everyone's expectations and making sure the day goes smoothly. Maybe we could have dinner next week, just the three of us, and you could hear all about it then?" I could hear Charlotte in the background, her voice too low to make out words but clearly coaching him through this conversation. She was literally standing there, directing him on how to exclude his own mother from the announcement of her first grandchild. "David," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I am not too many people. I am your mother. This is my grandchild we're talking about." "I know, Mom, I know." But Charlotte's hormones are all over the place right now, and she gets really anxious when she feels overwhelmed. I'm just trying to keep stress levels down for the baby's sake." And there it was, the perfect manipulation. Not only was I being excluded, but if I objected, I would be the unreasonable one putting stress on the pregnant woman and potentially harming my unborn grandchild. Charlotte had found the ultimate weapon, and she was wielding it with surgical precision. "Fine," I said, the word coming out sharper than I intended. "Have your party, but I want to be clear about something, David. This is a choice you're making. Don't pretend it's about Charlotte's stress levels or party logistics. You are choosing to exclude your mother from one of the most important announcements of your life." "Mom, please don't be dramatic." I hung up. For the first time in David's adult life, I had ended a conversation with him. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the silent phone, feeling like I'd just severed something that could never be repaired. But I also felt something else, a tiny spark of self-respect that I'd almost forgotten existed. Saturday came and went. I saw the photos on social media, of course. Charlotte glowing in a designer maternity dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, surrounded by her family and friends. David beaming beside her, looking happier than I'd seen him in months. Tables decorated with baby-themed centerpieces, a cake announcing Baby Davis coming February 2024, toasts and celebrations and joy that I was not. But it was the comments that really twisted the knife. Charlotte's friends gushing about what wonderful parents they'd be. Her mother posting about how excited she was to be a grandmother. David's college friends congratulating him on this new chapter. All of these people had been invited to celebrate my grandchild while I sat at home, officially uninvited from my own family's happiness. The following Monday, David called again. His voice was subdued, lacking the artificial brightness from our previous conversation. "Mom, I saw that you didn't comment on any of the photos from Saturday." "I don't typically comment on events I'm not invited to," I replied coolly. "Look, I know you're upset, but Charlotte really is having a hard time with the pregnancy. Her doctor says stress can cause complications, and—" "Stop," I interrupted. "Just stop. Don't you dare use that baby as an excuse for treating me like I don't matter. I carried you for 9 months, David. I know what pregnancy is like, and I know the difference between hormonal sensitivity and deliberate cruelty." "It's not cruelty, Mom. Charlotte doesn't have anything against you personally. She's just trying to manage a complicated situation." "What's complicated about including your child's grandmother in family celebrations?" The silence stretched between us. Finally, David spoke, and his words revealed the truth I'd been dreading to hear. "Mom, you have to understand. Charlotte's family, they're different from us. They have certain expectations about how things should be done, how families should look. It's not personal." "How families should look," I repeated. "You mean families where the grandmother isn't too old, too wrinkled, too embarrassing to be in photos?" That's not what I meant, isn't it? Because that's exactly what Charlotte said at Christmas, David. She said I was too old and wrinkled for your family photos, and you said nothing. You stood there and let your wife insult your mother, and now you're asking me to accept being excluded from my own grandchild's life, because it might stress her out to have me around. She didn't mean it the way it sounded. How did she mean it then? Explain to me how telling someone they're too ugly for family photos can be interpreted as anything other than cruel. Another long silence. When David spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She's my wife, Mom. I have to support her." And there it was. The choice had been made long ago, but this was the first time David had stated it so clearly. When forced to choose between his wife's preferences and his mother's dignity, he chose Charlotte. When faced with defending me or keeping peace in his marriage, he chose peace. When confronted with standing up for what was right or taking the path of least resistance, he chose the easy way out. "I understand," I said, and for the first time in this entire conversation, I meant it. I finally understood exactly where I stood in my son's priorities. And more importantly, I understood that no amount of accommodation or understanding on my part was going to change that. Thank you, Mom. I knew you'd... I understand, I repeated, cutting him off. That you've made your choice. You've chosen to prioritize Charlotte's comfort over your mother's feelings. You've chosen to exclude me from your life to avoid conflict in your marriage. And you've chosen to let your wife treat me with disrespect because it's easier than standing up to her. That's not fair. What's not fair, David, is a mother being told she's too ugly for family photos. What's not fair is being excluded from her son's major life events. What's not fair is having to beg for scraps of attention from the child she raised and sacrificed everything for. I took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside me, something that had been broken finally snapping into a new configuration. But you're right about one thing, I continued. You do have to support your wife, and I have to support myself. So here's what's going to happen. I'm done begging for inclusion in your life. I'm done accepting crumbs and pretending they're enough. If you and Charlotte want to exclude me from your family, then that's exactly what you'll get. Don't call me when you need something. Don't invite me when it's convenient. And don't expect me to keep playing the role of the grateful, accommodating mother who's thankful for whatever attention you throw her way. Mom, you're overreacting. Am I? Or am I finally reacting appropriately to months of systematic disrespect? I hung up again, and this time, I turned off my phone. For the first time in years, the silence felt like freedom instead of abandonment. The silence that followed my confrontation with David was deafening. For 3 days, my phone sat turned off on my kitchen counter like a small, dark accusation. I found myself reaching for it dozens of times, muscle memory compelling me to check for messages that weren't there, calls that hadn't come. The absence of communication felt both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in David's adult life, we weren't speaking, and I had no idea if this rift could ever be repaired. When I finally turned the phone back on, there were no missed calls, no voicemails, no text messages. The screen remained stubbornly blank, confirming what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. David wasn't going to fight for our relationship. He wasn't going to call and apologize, wasn't going to recognize the magnitude of what had happened between us, wasn't going to choose me over the path of least resistance. My absence from his life was apparently easier to accept than confronting the problems that had caused it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had raised a son who would rather lose his mother than disappoint his wife. All those years of teaching him to stand up for what was right, to protect the people he loved, to value character over convenience. Apparently, none of it had stuck when it really mattered. I took a leave of absence from school, something I'd never done in 32 years of teaching. Margaret Ellis covered my classes without question, understanding instinctively that I needed time to process what felt like the complete collapse of the most important relationship in my life. For the first week, I barely left my apartment. I moved through the motions of daily life like a ghost, making coffee I didn't drink, preparing meals I couldn't taste, sitting in front of television shows I didn't see. The worst part was the constant mental replay of every interaction I'd had with Charlotte, every conversation with David, every moment where I'd swallowed my hurt feelings for the sake of family harmony. I tortured myself with alternate scenarios. What if I'd spoken up sooner? What if I'd been firmer about boundaries from the beginning? What if I'd demanded respect instead of hoping to earn it through accommodation? But gradually, as the initial shock began to fade, something else started to emerge from the wreckage of my relationship with David. It was anger, but not the hot, reactive kind that had fueled our final phone conversation. This was something colder and more focused, a clarity about what had been done to me and a determination to understand exactly how I'd allowed it to happen. I began keeping a journal, writing down every incident I could remember, every slight and exclusion and casual cruelty that had brought us to this point. The pattern that emerged was staggering in its systematic precision. Charlotte hadn't just disliked me from the beginning. She had launched a calculated campaign to erase me from David's life, and I had been so focused on being the perfect mother-in-law that I'd handed her the tools to do it. Every time I'd accepted an explanation for why I couldn't be included, I'd reinforced the idea that my exclusion was reasonable. Every time I'd swallowed an insult for the sake of keeping peace, I'd taught them that I would tolerate any level of disrespect. Every time I'd prioritized David's comfort over my own dignity, I'd shown them that my feelings didn't matter as much as their convenience. The most painful revelation was that David's transformation hadn't happened in spite of my efforts to maintain our relationship. It had happened because of them. By consistently choosing accommodation over confrontation, I'd enabled his gradual shift away from the values I'd tried to instill in him. I'd made it easy for him to treat me poorly because I'd never demanded better. But as devastating as these realizations were, they were also oddly empowering. For the first time in years, I was seeing the situation clearly, without the filter of desperate hope that things would somehow improve if I just tried harder to earn Charlotte's approval. I wasn't the problem here. I was a good mother who had raised a decent son, and if that son was now choosing to treat me with disrespect, that said something about him, not about me. 3 weeks into my leave of absence, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called a real estate agent and put my apartment on the market, not because I was running away, but because I was tired of living in a space that felt small and cramped by the weight of my diminished expectations. If David and Charlotte wanted to exclude me from their expanding family, then I would expand my own life in ways they couldn't control. The apartment sold within a week to a young couple who were charmed by its location near the school district. With the equity I'd built up over 15 years, plus the modest inheritance I'd received when my own mother passed away 5 years earlier, I had enough money to buy something much nicer. A small house with a garden in a neighborhood I'd always admired but never thought I could afford. Moving was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Packing up 32 years of accumulated possessions forced me to confront what I actually valued versus what I'd been holding on to out of habit or sentiment. I donated bags of clothes I'd kept because they still fit, not because I liked them. I threw away cards and gifts from David and Charlotte that had felt obligatory rather than meaningful. I kept the photos of David's childhood, but I put them in albums rather than displaying them prominently. They were precious memories, but they weren't my entire identity. The new house was a revelation. It had hardwood floors that gleamed in the sunlight, windows that actually opened to let in fresh air, and a backyard where I could plant the vegetable garden I'd always wanted but never had space for. For the first time in years, I was making decisions based purely on what I wanted, not on what would be most convenient for other people or what would make me seem less burdensome. I also began taking better care of myself in ways I'd neglected for years. I started going to a hair salon that specialized in styles for mature women, where my silver hair was treated as beautiful rather than something to apologize for. I bought clothes that fit well and made me feel confident rather than trying to dress in a way that wouldn't embarrass David and Charlotte. I joined a gym that offered classes specifically designed for women over 60, where my age was an asset rather than a liability. Most importantly, I began building new relationships. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at the community garden, and accepted invitations from colleagues I'd been too preoccupied with David's problems to properly appreciate. I discovered that I was actually quite good at making friends when I wasn't constantly worried about being too much trouble or taking up too much space. Margaret Ellis became a regular visitor to my new house, and our friendship deepened in ways it couldn't when I'd been consumed by the drama with Charlotte and David. She helped me plant my first vegetable garden and celebrated with me when the tomatoes I'd grown from seed produced their first ripe fruit. These small victories felt more meaningful than any of the elaborate celebrations I'd been excluded from. The hardest part of this period was learning to sit with the uncertainty about David and my future grandchild. Every day I wondered if he would call, if he would recognize what he'd lost, if Charlotte would have a change of heart about including me in their lives. But gradually, I began to accept that these outcomes were beyond my control. I could only control my own actions and reactions, and I was finally learning to choose self-respect over false hope. By the time autumn arrived, I felt like a different person than the woman who had been humiliated at that Christmas party 9 months earlier. I wasn't bitter or vengeful. If anything, I felt more compassionate toward the woman I'd been, the mother who had loved her son so much that she'd been willing to sacrifice her own dignity to maintain their relationship. But I was also determined never to put myself in that position again. I had rediscovered who I was outside of my role as David's mother, and I liked that person. I was smart, capable, kind, and deserving of respect. If David and Charlotte couldn't see that, it was their loss, not mine. What I didn't know was that very soon they would have a chance to discover exactly what they'd lost and exactly what it was going to cost them to get it back. It was a gray Tuesday morning in late October when everything changed. I was in my kitchen, enjoying my second cup of coffee while reading the local newspaper, a luxury I'd rediscovered since moving into my new house, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed David's name, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. We hadn't spoken in over 3 months, not since our confrontation about the baby announcement party, and I'd grown comfortable with the silence, but curiosity won out. I answered on the 4th ring. "Hello, David. Mom?" His voice sounded strained, tired in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager struggling with his father's death. I need to talk to you." "About what?" I kept my tone neutral, neither warm nor cold. I'd learned not to make assumptions about David's motivations anymore. "Can I come over? To your new place? I have the address from the change of address card you sent." I glanced around my small, comfortable living room with its warm lighting and carefully chosen furniture. This was my sanctuary now, the place I'd built to reflect who I was rather than who other people needed me to be. The thought of David entering this space, potentially bringing his judgment and Charlotte's influence with him, made me hesitate. "Why?" I asked simply. There was a long pause. "Because I'm in trouble, Mom. Real trouble. And I don't know what else to do." Something in his voice, vulnerability mixed with genuine desperation, cut through my carefully constructed emotional barriers. This wasn't the polished, confident man who had been making excuses for his wife's behavior. This was my son, scared and asking for help. "Come over," I said. "I'll make lunch." He arrived an hour later, and I barely recognized him. The expensive suits had been replaced by jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Most telling of all, he was driving a different car, not the luxury sedan Charlotte had insisted they lease, but an older Honda that looked like it had seen better days. "Nice place," he said as I let him in, his eyes taking in the hardwood, floors, the comfortable furniture, the photographs I'd chosen to display, pictures of my students, my friends, my travels, my life beyond motherhood. "Thank you. I'm happy here." We sat at my kitchen table, the same one I'd had in my old apartment, but which somehow looked better in this new space. I served him the soup I'd made from vegetables grown in my own garden, along with fresh bread from the bakery down the street. He ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't been taking proper care of himself. "How's Charlotte?" I asked when he'd finished most of his bowl. His face cracked, and for a moment I thought he might cry. "She left me, Mom, 2 weeks ago. Moved back in with her parents and took everything. The furniture, the art, even the dishes. She said she couldn't stay married to someone who couldn't provide the lifestyle she expected." I absorbed this information carefully, fighting the urge to either celebrate Charlotte's departure or immediately comfort David. What happened? The story that emerged was both shocking and inevitable. David had been living far beyond his means for years, using credit cards and loans to maintain the expensive lifestyle Charlotte expected. The house payments, the luxury cars, the designer clothes, the elaborate vacations, none of it had been sustainable on his marketing salary. But he'd convinced himself that his career trajectory would eventually catch up to his spending. Then his company had been acquired by a larger firm, and the new owners had eliminated his entire department. David had been out of work for 2 months, burning through their savings and maxing out credit cards to keep up appearances. He'd hidden the job loss from Charlotte as long as possible, making excuses about working from home and taking meetings. That didn't exist. She found out when the mortgage company called, he said, his voice hollow. We were 3 months behind on the house payments. She went through all our financial statements that night and discovered everything. The credit, card debt, the car loans, the personal loans I'd taken out just to make minimum payments on other debts. How much debt? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. $250,000, not including the mortgage. I kept my expression neutral, but internally I was staggered. That was more money than I'd made in 5 years of teaching. What did Charlotte say when she found out? David laughed bitterly. She said I'd deceived her about who I really was, that she'd married someone she thought was successful and ambitious, not someone who was pretending to be something he couldn't afford to be. She packed her things that night and was gone by morning. And the baby? She's keeping it, but she says she won't let me be involved unless I can prove I'm financially stable. Her lawyer is demanding full custody and child support payments I can't possibly make in my current situation. I'll be lucky if I'm allowed supervised visitation. The picture was becoming clearer. Charlotte hadn't just left David. She'd systematically removed everything of value from his life and positioned herself to claim ongoing financial support while denying him access to his own child. It was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, and I almost had to admire its efficiency. What about your job search? I asked. That's the problem. Word has gotten around about the company acquisition and the layoffs. Everyone in the industry knows. Our whole department was cut, and they're assuming there was poor performance involved. Plus, with all the debt and the divorce proceedings, I can't focus on interviews properly. I bombed 3 good opportunities because I was so distracted. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so familiar from his childhood that it made my heart ache despite everything. The house is going into foreclosure next month. I'm living in a studio apartment in the worst part of town, driving a 15-year-old car I bought for cash from the last of our savings. Everything I thought I'd built, everything I thought I was, it's all gone. I'm sorry this happened to you, I said, and I meant it. Regardless of how David had treated me, I didn't want to see him suffering like this. I know I don't have any right to ask, he continued, his voice getting smaller. But I was wondering. I mean, I know things haven't been good between us, and I know I haven't been the son you deserved, but what do you need, David? I need help with the mortgage. Just enough to catch up on the back payments and maybe cover a few months while I get back on my feet. I know it's a lot to ask, especially after everything that's happened, but I don't have anyone else to turn to. Charlotte's parents made it clear they think I'm a loser who trapped their daughter, and my friends. Well, it turns out most of them were really Charlotte's friends. He looked up at me with eyes that reminded me painfully of the 8-year-old boy who had needed comfort after his father's funeral. I've lost everything, Mom. My wife, my house, my job, my future with my child. The only thing I have left is the hope that maybe, somehow, you might be willing to help me. I studied my son's face, seeing both the scared young man asking for help and the adult who had stood silently while his wife humiliated me. I thought about the 3 months of silence, the systematic exclusions, the casual cruelties that had been inflicted on me in the name of Charlotte's comfort. I thought about the baby announcement party I wasn't invited to, the Christmas photos I was too old and wrinkled for, the careful way David had edited me out of his life to avoid inconveniencing his wife. And then I thought about the bank statements I'd been reviewing just that morning, the healthy balance that represented 32 years of careful saving and modest living. I thought about the investment portfolio I'd built over decades of putting away small amounts each month, the life insurance policy that had matured, the inheritance from my mother that I'd barely touched. I had the means to help David. That wasn't the question. The question was whether I was willing to help him on his terms, or whether this was finally my opportunity to establish new terms entirely. I might be able to help you, I said carefully. But if I do, it won't be the way things used to be between us. I'm not the same person I was 3 months ago, David, and I won't go back to being taken for granted and pushed aside whenever it's convenient. Hope flickered in his eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. What do you mean? I smiled, feeling a power I'd never experienced before. Not the power to hurt him, but the power to help him on my terms, in a way that would finally establish the respect and dignity I'd been denied for so long. I mean, David, that it's time for us to have a very different kind of conversation about what family means and what it's going to cost you to remember that I'm part of yours. I let the silence stretch between us for a long moment, watching David process what I'd just said. The hope in his eyes was tempered now with uncertainty. He could sense that this conversation wasn't going to follow the script he'd imagined, where his desperate mother would simply write a check and ask for nothing in return except the privilege of being included in his life again. What kind of conversation? He asked carefully. I stood up and walked to my kitchen counter, where I kept a folder of financial documents. I'd been expecting this moment, or something like it, ever since I'd learned about David's job loss through a mutual acquaintance 2 weeks earlier. The small-town teaching community was surprisingly well-connected, and word had traveled quickly about David's situation. I'd had time to think, to plan, and most importantly, to decide what I was and wasn't willing to do. First, I said, returning to the table with the folder, let's talk about what you're actually asking for. You said you need help with the mortgage. How much exactly? David shifted uncomfortably. The back payments are about $18,000, and the monthly payment going forward is $3,200. So you need at least $18,000 immediately, plus ongoing monthly support of over $3,000. For how long? I don't know. 6 months? A year? Until I can get back on my feet and find a good job. I opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper I'd prepared. So we're talking about a minimum of $56,000, and possibly much more, depending on how long your job search takes. David winced at seeing the number written down. When you put it like that, it sounds like a lot. It is a lot, David. It's more than I made in 2 years of teaching. It's a significant portion of my retirement savings, money I've spent 32 years accumulating through careful budgeting and sacrifice. I know, and I wouldn't ask if I weren't desperate. But here's what's interesting, I continued, pulling out another document. I've been doing some research since I heard about your situation. Your house, the one you're about to lose to foreclosure. What do you think it's worth? I don't know. Maybe $400,000? We bought it for $382 years ago. I slid the paper across to him. It was a recent market analysis I'd commissioned from a real estate agent friend. Try $460,000. Even after the outstanding mortgage balance, you're looking at about $100,000 in equity that's about to disappear in the foreclosure. David stared at the numbers, his face pale. I had no idea it had appreciated that much. Of course you didn't. You were too busy trying to keep up with Charlotte's lifestyle to pay attention to what you actually owned. I let that sink in before continuing. But here's what I'm thinking. Instead of throwing good money after bad by helping you make payments on a house you clearly can't afford, what if I bought it from you? Bought it? But it's my house. Mine and Charlotte's. Charlotte left David. She made it clear she wants nothing to do with you or your financial problems. And you're about to lose it anyway, unless someone intervenes. But if I buy it from you at fair market value, you walk away with cash in your pocket instead of a foreclosure on your credit report. I could see him trying to process this, trying to figure out where the catch was. But then, where would I live? That's the beautiful part, I said, pulling out a rental agreement I'd had. My lawyer draft. You could rent it back from me. Fair market rent for a house that size in that neighborhood is about $2,200 a month. Much more manageable than a $3,200 mortgage payment. David was quiet for a long time, reading through the documents. Finally, he looked up at me. This would solve my immediate problem, but I still don't have a job. How would I make rent payments? We'll get to that. But first, I want to establish some ground rules for our new relationship. New relationship? I leaned back in my chair, feeling more confident than I had in years. David, for the past 2 years, you've allowed your wife to systematically exclude me from your life. You've stood by while she insulted me, dismissed me, and treated me like an embarrassing relic who needed to be hidden away. You've prioritized her comfort over my dignity, and you've made it clear that my feelings don't matter as much as avoiding conflict in your marriage. David started to speak, but I held up a hand. I'm not finished. You excluded me from your baby announcement, my first grandchild, because Charlotte found my presence stressful. You allowed her to tell me I was too old and wrinkled for family photos. You've canceled plans, forgotten birthdays, and gradually pushed me to the margins of your life, all while expecting me to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you threw my way. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sure you are. Now, when you need something from me, but I'm not interested in apologies that are motivated by desperation. I'm interested in changed behavior, and that's going to require some conditions. I pulled out another document, a detailed agreement I'd spent weeks crafting with my lawyer's help. If I buy your house and rent it back to you, here's what I expect in return. First, I want full grandparent rights to my grandchild. I want regular visitation. I want to be included in major decisions about the baby's upbringing. And I want Charlotte to understand that cutting me out of this child's life is not an option. David's eyes widened. I don't have any control over Charlotte right now. She's not even speaking to me. Then you'll need to figure out how to establish some control, won't you? Because this is non-negotiable. I'm not investing $50,000 in your life just to be excluded from my grandchild's existence. What else? I want full inclusion in family events from now on. Real inclusion, not token invitations. I want to be consulted about major decisions that affect our family. I want my opinion to matter, my presence to be welcomed, and my contributions to be valued. I slid the rental agreement across to him. This contract has some unusual clauses. Your rent will be reduced by $200 for every family event I'm genuinely included in. It will be reduced by another $100 for every month I have meaningful contact with my grandchild. But it will increase by $500 for every time I'm excluded, dismissed, or treated with disrespect. David stared at the document, clearly trying to process the implications. You're financially incentivizing good behavior. I'm establishing boundaries with real consequences. For too long, treating me poorly has been free for you. Now it's going to cost you, literally. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. You're right. Families are supposed to work on love, respect, and mutual consideration. But since those principles haven't been working for us, we're going to try a more structured approach until you remember how to treat your mother properly. David was quiet for several minutes, reading through the contract terms. Finally, he looked up at me. What about Charlotte? Even if I agree to all this, she's not going to suddenly start including you in things. She blames you for a lot of things. What does she blame me for? She says you raised me to have unrealistic expectations about marriage, that you spoiled me by doing everything for me, so I never learned to be a proper husband. She thinks you undermined our relationship by making me feel guilty about not spending enough time with you. I laughed, at the absurdity of it. So I'm responsible for your financial irresponsibility, your inability to stand up to your wife, and your failure to maintain adult relationships? That's fascinating. What else am I responsible for? She says if you'd backed off more, if you'd given us space to build our marriage without interference, things might have worked out differently. David, I gave you so much space that I barely existed in your life. I accepted every exclusion, swallowed every insult, and asked for nothing except basic respect. If that constitutes interference, then Charlotte's definition of marriage is one where husbands have no family connections outside their wives. I stood up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the garden I'd planted with my own hands. But here's the thing. Charlotte's opinion of me doesn't matter anymore. What matters is whether you're willing to establish a relationship with me based on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. I turned back to face him. The house purchase offer stands for 48 hours. The rental agreement terms are non-negotiable. You can take it or leave it, but I won't be making this offer again. David looked at the papers spread across my kitchen table, then back at me. For the first time since he'd arrived, he was seeing me clearly, not as the desperate mother who would do anything to maintain contact with her son, but as a woman with her own resources, her own power, and her own terms. I need to think about this, he said finally. Of course you do. But while you're thinking, remember something. I've already proven I can live without you in my life. The question is whether you can afford to live without me in yours. I walked him to the door, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time in our relationship, I held all the cards, and we both knew it. The next 24 hours would determine whether my son was ready to remember what family really meant. David called the next evening, just after I'd finished dinner. I was sitting on my back porch, enjoying the cool October air and the satisfaction of looking at the tomatoes I'd grown myself, when his name appeared on my phone screen. I accept your terms, he said without preamble. All of them. I felt a complex mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. You're sure? You understand what you're agreeing to? I understand that I've been an idiot for the past 2 years, and that you're offering me a chance to fix things while also solving my immediate problems. I understand that treating you the way I have been treating you is going to cost me money I can't afford to lose. And I understand that if I want a relationship with my child, I need to make sure you have one too. What changed your mind? There was a long pause. I went to see Charlotte yesterday to try to talk to her about custody arrangements, visitation, rights, that kind of thing. She wouldn't even let me in the house. Made me stand on her parents' front porch like I was some kind of door-to-door salesman. I waited for him to continue. She told me that her lawyer thinks she can get full custody and maximum child support because I'm financially unstable and have no family support system. When I mentioned that you might be willing to help me get back on my feet, she just laughed. She said, "Your pathetic mother who we never invited to anything anyway, the one who's too old to be in photos. She's not exactly character witness material, David." The casual cruelty in Charlotte's words didn't surprise me, but I could hear how much they'd hurt David. That's when I realized something, he continued. The woman I married, the woman I defended to you, the woman I prioritized over my own mother, she never respected any of us. She didn't just think you weren't good enough for her perfect family photos. She thought I wasn't good enough either. I was just useful until I stopped being able to provide the lifestyle she wanted. I'm sorry you had to learn that the hard way. Are you? Because I think part of you saw this coming from the beginning. Mai was right, and we both knew it. I saw that Charlotte had very specific ideas about how life should look, and that those ideas didn't include much room for people who didn't fit her aesthetic. But I hoped I was wrong. I hoped that she would learn to value what you brought to her life, and that you would remember to value the people who loved you before she came along. I never stopped loving you, Mom. No, but you stopped showing it. You stopped defending me. You stopped making space for me in your life. Love without action is just a feeling, David. It doesn't actually mean anything to the person who's being excluded. The silence stretched between us, but it felt different than the hostile silences of our previous conversations. This felt like David actually processing what I was saying instead of just waiting for his turn to make excuses. The house papers can be ready by the end of the week, I said finally. I've already been pre-approved for the mortgage. You'll walk away with about $90,000 after paying off your debts and covering the closing costs. That's incredibly generous. It's fair market value. I'm not giving you charity, David. I'm making a business deal that happens to solve both of our problems. Over the following weeks, the transformation in our relationship was remarkable. Without Charlotte's influence shaping every interaction, David seemed to remember who he'd been before he'd gotten caught up in trying to impress people who would never be impressed enough. He helped me with the house paperwork, and we spent hours going through documents and discussing practical details. For the first time in years, we were working together toward a common goal instead of navigating around Charlotte's preferences and prejudices. The house purchase went through smoothly, and David moved into the studio apartment above the garage, a space that had been converted by the previous owners, but which Charlotte had never allowed him to use because she thought it was beneath them to rent out part of their home. Now it provided David with affordable housing while generating rental income that helped cover the mortgage payments. More importantly, it put us in regular contact without the artificial barriers that Charlotte had erected. David would stop by the main house most evenings, sometimes to discuss practical matters, but increasingly just to talk. We began cooking dinner together on Sundays, reestablishing a tradition that had been lost when Charlotte decided that family dinners were too time-consuming and unsophisticated. The real test came in December, when Charlotte went into labor 3 weeks early. David called me from the hospital at 2 a.m, his voice shaking with a mixture of excitement and terror. "Mom, the baby's coming. Charlotte's in labor, and I don't know what to do. She won't let me in the delivery room, and her parents are treating me like I'm some kind of criminal who's going to steal hospital equipment." "What do you want to do?" I asked, already getting dressed. "I want to be there when my child is born. I want to make sure Charlotte and the baby are okay, and I want—" He paused, then continued in a smaller voice. "I want you there too. I know Charlotte won't like it, but I need someone on my side, someone who actually cares about me and not just about controlling the situation." I drove to the hospital and found David pacing in the waiting room while Charlotte's parents held court near the maternity ward doors, blocking access like well-dressed security guards. When they saw me approaching, Amelia Davis straightened up with the kind of expression usually reserved for unwelcome insects. "Grace, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to support my son during the birth of my grandchild," I said calmly. "The same reason you're here. This is a private family matter. Charlotte specifically said she didn't want any complications during this time." "I am family," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "And if you try to prevent me from being here for my son and grandchild, we're going to have a very public conversation about what constitutes appropriate behavior in a hospital waiting room." For the first time in our acquaintance, Amelia Davis backed down. She might have been comfortable bullying me in her own territory, but she wasn't prepared for a confrontation in neutral space where her social advantages didn't apply. David looked relieved to have backup, and together, we waited through the long hours of Charlotte's labor. When baby Emma Charlotte Davis was finally born, Charlotte had refused to give her David's last name. David was allowed a brief visit before being dismissed again. But I had prepared for this moment. While David held his daughter for the first time, I handed him an envelope. "What's this? What's this?" A trust fund for Emma's education, $50,000, managed by an independent trustee, with regular contributions planned for the next 18 years. David stared at the documents, "Mom, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Because Charlotte is going to use money as a weapon in your custody battle, and Emma is going to suffer for it. This way, no matter what happens between you and Charlotte, Emma will have educational opportunities that no one can take away from her." But the trust fund came with conditions, of course. The money could only be accessed if I maintained regular contact with Emma. If I was excluded from her life, the funds would be redirected to other educational charities. It was an elegant solution that guaranteed my place in my granddaughter's life while providing for her future. Charlotte's reaction when she learned about the trust fund was predictable. She was furious that I had found a way to make myself essential to Emma's financial security, but she was also practical enough to recognize that $50,000 plus ongoing contributions represented an opportunity she couldn't afford to reject. The custody arrangement that eventually emerged reflected this new reality. David got regular visitation rights, I got grandparent access, and Charlotte got the assurance that Emma's future was financially secure, regardless of David's career prospects. It wasn't the warm, loving, extended family relationship I had originally hoped for, but it was something better. It was honest. Charlotte and I would never be friends, but we had established a working relationship based on mutual benefit rather than pretended affection. David would never again be the naive young man who believed that love conquered all, but he had learned to value the relationships that provided substance rather than just status. Most importantly, Emma would grow up knowing all her family, understanding that love came in many forms, and learning that real security came from authentic relationships rather than perfect appearances. 6 months later, as I watched David push Emma in the swing set I'd had installed in our backyard, I reflected on how much had changed since that humiliating Christmas photo incident. I had learned that demanding respect was more effective than hoping to earn it. David had learned that choosing the easy path often led to harder consequences. And Emma was learning that she had a grandmother who would fight for her place in her life. The house arrangement had evolved into something that worked for all of us. David had found a new job with better work-life balance, which meant he could spend more time with Emma during his custody visits. Charlotte had begun bringing Emma for supervised visits, partly because the trust fund required it, but increasingly because she was beginning to understand that Emma benefited from having multiple adults who loved her unconditionally. Was it perfect? No. Charlotte still made cutting remarks about my age and appearance, though less frequently and never in front of Emma. David still sometimes defaulted to conflict avoidance when tensions arose, though he was getting better at standing up for what mattered. And I still had moments of sadness about the years we'd lost to pride and misunderstanding. But it was real, and it was sustainable, and it was built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than desperate accommodation. Sometimes the best families aren't the ones that look perfect in photos. They're the ones that work through their problems honestly and find ways to love each other despite their flaws. As I watched my granddaughter discover the joy of homegrown tomatoes, her face lighting up with the same wonder David had shown at her age, I realized that we had built something worth fighting for, after all. 2 years had passed since Emma's birth, and the ripple effects of our family's transformation continued to spread in ways I hadn't anticipated. What had begun as a desperate financial arrangement between David and me had evolved into something much more significant, a complete restructuring of how our family operated, with lessons that extended far beyond our own situation. The most unexpected development was how our story had begun to influence other families in similar situations. Margaret Ellis, my former teaching colleague who had been my confidant through the darkest days of my conflict with Charlotte, had shared our experience with her own daughter, who was struggling with an overbearing daughter-in-law. Within months, I found myself having coffee with women who had heard about the grandmother who bought her way back into her family and wanted advice on setting their own boundaries. "The thing is," explained Patricia Williams, a retired nurse whose son had married into a wealthy family that treated her like hired help, "I always thought I had to choose between having dignity and having access to my grandchildren. You proved that was a false choice. These conversations revealed that our situation hadn't been unique. There was an entire generation of mothers who had raised independent, successful men, only to find themselves marginalized by daughters-in-law who saw them as obstacles to their perfect family narratives. Many of these women had spent years accepting crumbs of affection and manufactured exclusions, believing that accommodation was their only option for maintaining relationships with their adult children. My approach, using financial leverage to establish boundaries and demand respect, wasn't feasible for everyone. Not every grandmother had the resources to buy a house or establish a trust fund. But the underlying principle was universally applicable. Relationships had to be based on mutual respect, and sometimes that respect had to be demanded rather than requested. I began hosting monthly gatherings in my home, Coffee and Boundaries, Margaret jokingly called them, where women could share their experiences and strategize about improving their family dynamics. These weren't therapy sessions or formal support groups, just informal conversations among women who had discovered that they didn't have to accept poor treatment just because it came from family members. The stories that emerged were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Linda Rodriguez had been excluded from her grandson's birthday parties for 3 years because her daughter-in-law claimed she was too emotional and might upset the other parents. After hearing about my situation, Linda had a frank conversation with her son about what she would and wouldn't tolerate, threatening to cut off the substantial childcare she provided if the exclusions continued. The birthday party invitations resumed immediately. Helen Thompson had been relegated to awkward holiday visits where she felt like an unwelcome guest in her own son's home. Following my example, she had stopped accepting these uncomfortable arrangements and instead invited her son's family to visit her on her terms. When they declined, she spent the holidays with friends who valued her company, posting photos of her celebrations on social media. Her son, seeing how much joy she found in relationships where she was appreciated, began making more effort to include her meaningfully in their lives. These weren't stories of vindictive grandmothers seeking revenge, but rather accounts of women who had learned to value themselves enough to demand basic respect. The results were remarkably consistent. When these mothers stopped accepting poor treatment, their relationships with their adult children either improved significantly or revealed themselves to be too damaged to salvage. But either outcome was better than the slow degradation of self-worth that came from constantly accepting less than they deserved. David, meanwhile, had become something of an inadvertent spokesperson for sons who had lost their way in toxic marriages. He began volunteering with a men's support group focused on rebuilding family relationships after divorce, sharing his experience of how he'd allowed his wife's prejudices to damage his relationship with his mother. "I thought I was being a good husband by putting my wife's comfort above everything else," he told one group session I was invited to observe. "But what I was really doing was enabling her worst impulses while abandoning my own values. I let her convince me that my mother's love was somehow less important than her approval." His insights resonated with other men who had found themselves caught between demanding wives and hurt parents. David's story provided a roadmap for rebuilding these relationships, acknowledging the damage that had been done, accepting responsibility for their choices, and committing to changed behavior rather than just apologetic words. The financial structure we'd established had also proven unexpectedly effective. The rental agreement with its behavior-based adjustments had worked exactly as intended, providing concrete consequences for poor treatment while rewarding genuine inclusion and respect. David's rent had steadily decreased as he learned to prioritize family harmony over conflict avoidance, and the trust fund for Emma had ensured that Charlotte couldn't use financial manipulation to control access to my granddaughter. This model had been adopted by several other families with similar dynamics. Thomas Clark, whose daughter had married a man who considered Thomas's blue-collar background embarrassing, had restructured his will to include behavior-based bequests. His inheritance would be distributed based on how well his daughter's family treated him in his later years with regular evaluations to ensure the respect was genuine rather than performative. Rose Martinez had established a college fund for her grandsons that required regular family participation. The boys could only access the money if their parents maintained respectful relationships with both sets of grandparents. When her son-in-law tried to exclude her from family events, his wife reminded him that his children's educational future depended on treating all their grandparents well. These weren't manipulative schemes, but rather practical acknowledgments that behavior had consequences, and that family relationships required ongoing effort from all parties. By making respect and inclusion financially beneficial, these arrangements simply formalized what should have been happening naturally. Emma, now a precocious 2-year-old, had become the ultimate beneficiary of our family's restructuring. She split her time between Charlotte's elegant but sterile home and our more relaxed household, where she was free to dig in the garden, help with cooking, and get as messy as any toddler should. The contrast was beneficial for everyone. Charlotte was learning to relax her perfectionist standards when she saw how happy Emma was after our visits, while Emma was developing the confidence that came from unconditional acceptance. Most importantly, Emma was growing up with a clear understanding that families came in all shapes and sizes, that love didn't require perfection, and that respect was a non-negotiable requirement in all relationships. She would never accept poor treatment simply because it came from someone who claimed to love her, because she was learning from birth that love was demonstrated through actions, not just words. The legal community had also taken notice of our approach. Family lawyers reported an increase in clients requesting behavior-based inheritance structures and custody arrangements that prioritize the children's relationships with extended family members. These weren't punitive measures, but rather proactive steps to ensure that family dynamics remained healthy over time. Charlotte herself had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. The financial incentives had initially forced her to tolerate my presence, but gradually she had begun to appreciate the practical benefits of having another adult who was genuinely invested in Emma's well-being. When Emma had suffered a severe ear infection during one of Charlotte's work crises, I had been able to provide the round-the-clock care that Charlotte couldn't manage alone. "I never thanked you properly for that week," Charlotte had said recently during one of Emma's visits. "I was so focused on my career deadlines that I might have made Emma's illness worse by trying to juggle everything myself. It wasn't an apology for her previous behavior, and I didn't expect one. But it was an acknowledgement that my presence in Emma's life provided value beyond what Charlotte had originally recognized. We would never be close friends, but we had developed a functional partnership centered around Emma's needs rather than our personal preferences. The broader lesson seemed to be that families, like any other relationships, required ongoing negotiation and mutual respect to remain healthy. The traditional model of unconditional family loyalty, where blood relations excused any level of poor treatment, was being replaced by more sophisticated approaches that recognized the difference between love and enabling, between loyalty and doormat behavior. Our story had become a small but significant part of a larger cultural shift toward expecting better from family relationships, toward recognizing that respect was a requirement rather than a luxury, and toward understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to accept poor treatment, even from people you cared about deeply. As I watched Emma carefully water the tomato plants we'd started together, her small hands serious with concentration, I felt proud of the legacy we were building together. Not just our family's recovery from near destruction, but our contribution to a broader understanding of what healthy family relationships could look like when they were built on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. As I reflect on this incredible journey, from exclusion to empowerment, I realize that our story touches on something much deeper than just one family's dysfunction. It's about a universal struggle that so many of us face: the challenge of maintaining our dignity and self-worth when people we love treat us as less than we deserve. I've received hundreds of messages since I first shared parts of our story. with friends and acquaintances. Women from all walks of life have reached out to tell me their own versions of being pushed aside, dismissed, or made to feel invisible by family members who should have valued them most. The details are different, but the pain is remarkably similar. That crushing realization that you've been accommodating disrespect for so long that it's become the norm. Sarah from Portland wrote to tell me about her daughter-in-law who insisted on scheduling every family gathering during Sarah's work hours, then acted hurt when Sarah couldn't attend. "Reading about your situation made me realize I wasn't crazy," she said. "These things really were deliberate, and I didn't have to keep pretending they weren't." Maria from Phoenix shared how her son's wife had gradually isolated him from his entire extended family by creating drama around every holiday and family event until it became easier to just not invite them. "Your story gave me the courage to stop making excuses for behavior that was clearly designed to hurt people," she wrote. "I confronted my son directly, and while it was uncomfortable, it finally opened his eyes to what was happening." Linda from Atlanta described how her daughter-in-law would consistently forget to include her in family photos at gatherings, then post the pictures on social media with captions about their complete family. "After reading about my Christmas photo experience, Linda stopped attending events where she was treated as invisible. The invitations became much more genuine when they realized I wasn't going to show up just to be ignored," she told me. "These conversations have taught me that our experience wasn't an isolated incident of one particularly difficult daughter-in-law, but rather a symptom of larger cultural patterns around family relationships, respect, and power dynamics. There's something about modern life, perhaps the emphasis on nuclear families over extended ones, or the way social media allows us to curate perfect family images that exclude inconvenient relatives, that has made it easier to push aside family members who don't fit someone's ideal narrative. But what I've learned, and what I hope others can take from our story, is that we don't have to accept this treatment just because it comes from family. Love doesn't require us to surrender our dignity. Maintaining relationships doesn't mean accepting any level of disrespect, and sometimes the most loving thing we can do, for ourselves and for the people who are treating us poorly, is to establish clear boundaries with real consequences. The financial leverage I used isn't available to everyone, and that's not the point. The point is that we all have some form of power in our relationships, even when we feel powerless. Sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's practical, sometimes it's simply the power to withdraw our cooperation from arrangements that don't serve us. The key is recognizing that we have choices, even when all the options feel difficult. Margaret, one of the women who started attending our monthly coffee gatherings, discovered her own form of leverage when her son's wife began excluding her from grandparent duties, but still expected her to provide emergency childcare whenever convenient. "I realized I was being treated like hired help, dismissed when I wasn't needed, but expected to drop everything when they had a crisis," she explained. "So I started treating it like a business relationship. No more free babysitting unless I was included in the fun stuff too." Patricia found her power in her expertise. As a retired nurse, she had been providing invaluable medical guidance for her grandson's chronic health condition, but her daughter-in-law would often dismiss her suggestions in favor of internet research. When Patricia stopped offering her professional insights, several minor health scares could have been avoided with her early intervention. The daughter-in-law quickly learned to value Patricia's knowledge and experience. For those of you who see yourself in my early story, the accommodating parent, the understanding in-law, the person who keeps making excuses for family members who treat you poorly, I want you to know that change is possible. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but relationships can be transformed when we stop accepting less than we deserve. Here are some practical steps that I learned through my own journey and that other women in similar situations have found helpful. First, document the patterns. Start keeping track of exclusions, dismissive comments, and instances where you're treated as less important than other family members. It's easy to gaslight ourselves into thinking we're overreacting when these incidents happen in isolation, but patterns become undeniable when they're written down. I wish I had started this practice earlier. It would have helped me recognize the systematic nature of Charlotte's campaign against me. Second, identify your own sources of power. Maybe you provide childcare or financial support or practical help that others depend on. Maybe you have information, connections, or skills that benefit the family. You're not powerless, even if you feel like it. Understanding what you bring to the table is the first step in demanding appropriate treatment. I had financial resources I'd never considered using strategically, but other women have found power in their time, skills, or emotional support. Third, practice saying no. Start small. Decline an invitation that feels designed to make you uncomfortable. Refuse to make excuses for someone else's poor behavior. Stop volunteering for thankless tasks. Each small assertion of your worth builds confidence for larger boundary-setting conversations. The first time I declined to participate in Charlotte's charade of family harmony felt terrifying, but it was also liberating. Fourth, build a support network outside the problematic relationship. I can't overstate how important my friendship with Margaret Ellis was during the worst periods of my conflict with Charlotte and David. Having people who saw my worth clearly helped me maintain perspective when family members were making me doubt myself. The women in our coffee group have become like family to each other, the kind of family where respect and affection go hand in hand. Fifth, be prepared for things to get worse before they get better. When you stop accommodating poor behavior, the people who benefited from your accommodation will often escalate their demands or punishments. This is normal and temporary. They're testing to see if your boundaries are real or if they can manipulate you back into your old patterns. David's initial reaction to my new terms was anger and disbelief, but that phase passed when he realized I was serious. The response to our story has been overwhelming, and it's shown me that these family dynamics are far more common than I ever realized. There's apparently a whole generation of mothers and mothers-in-law who have been quietly accepting poor treatment, thinking they had no other choice. But we do have choices, and making different ones can transform not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone in our families. I've been asked to speak at several community centers and women's groups about family boundaries and self-respect. Each time, the audience is filled with women nodding in recognition, women who see their own experiences reflected in our story. They ask practical questions about how to start difficult conversations, how to maintain boundaries when family members push back, how to distinguish between healthy compromise and unhealthy accommodation. The most rewarding part has been hearing back from women who have successfully transformed their own family relationships. Helen, who I mentioned earlier, sent me a photo from her son's recent birthday celebration, the first family event in 3 years, where she felt genuinely welcomed rather than merely tolerated. "I'm not just in the background of this picture," she wrote. "I'm right in the center, where I belong." These success stories prove that change is possible, but they also highlight how much work still needs to be done. Too many families are operating under outdated models that prioritize keeping peace over maintaining respect, that confuse love with accommodation, that mistake enabling for caring. The questions I receive most frequently from viewers and readers are about practical implementation. How do you start these conversations? What do you do when family members claim you're being manipulative or unreasonable? How do you maintain your resolve when emotional pressure is applied? These are complex questions without simple answers, but they all come back to the same fundamental principle. You cannot control other people's behavior, but you can control your response to it. You cannot force family members to respect you, but you can refuse to participate in arrangements where you're not respected. If our story resonates with you, I encourage you to share it with others who might be struggling with similar family dynamics. Not because I want attention or recognition, but because these issues thrive in isolation and secrecy. When we start talking openly about family dysfunction and boundary setting, We give other people permission to address their own situations, rather than suffering in silence. I also want to address those of you who might be in David's position, who have allowed partners to mistreat your family members, or who have gradually distanced yourselves from parents or siblings to avoid conflict. Your path back to healthy family relationships is possible too, but it requires acknowledging the damage that's been done and committing to changed behavior rather than just apologetic words. The stakes are higher than just individual comfort or convenience. The children in our families are watching how we treat each other, learning what love looks like, absorbing lessons about respect and dignity that will shape their own relationships for decades to come. 3 years have passed since that humiliating Christmas photo incident that changed everything, and as I write this final chapter of our story, Emma is playing in the garden we planted together, her laughter mixing with the sound of David fixing the back porch steps. It's an ordinary Sunday afternoon, the kind of family time I thought I'd lost forever, now restored and treasured in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark months of exclusion. But this isn't a fairy tale ending where everyone lived happily, ever after. Real families are messier than that, more complicated, more human. Charlotte still makes occasional comments about my appearance or lifestyle choices. David still sometimes defaults to conflict avoidance when tensions arise. And I still have moments of sadness about the years we lost to pride and misunderstanding. The difference is that we've learned to address these issues directly rather than letting them fester. When Charlotte made a snide remark about my outdated decorating choices last month, I responded calmly but firmly. Charlotte, comments about my personal choices aren't helpful to anyone. Let's focus on Emma's schedule instead. The conversation moved forward without the poisonous undertone that would have characterized our past interactions. When David recently tried to cancel one of our standing Sunday dinners because Charlotte had scheduled a social event, I reminded him of our agreement. David, you're welcome to make different choices, but they come with different consequences. The rental adjustment for breaking family commitments is still in effect. He rescheduled Charlotte's event. These aren't power games or manipulative tactics. They're simply the natural consequences of treating family relationships like the important, valuable connections they should be. When respect flows both ways, everyone benefits. When it doesn't, there are clear, predictable outcomes. The broader impact of our story continues to ripple outward in ways that surprise and humble me. The monthly gatherings at my house have grown into an informal network of women supporting each other through family boundary-setting challenges. We've helped dozens of grandmothers, mothers, and daughters-in-law navigate difficult family dynamics, with dignity intact. Last month, we celebrated a particularly meaningful success. Joan, whose daughter-in-law had been systematically excluding her from her grandson's life for 2 years, finally established consequences for this behavior. When the daughter-in-law called in a panic because she needed emergency childcare during a work crisis, Joan calmly explained that she was no longer available for emergency help since she'd been excluded from the regular, enjoyable parts of her grandson's life. It took exactly one missed work presentation for her to realize that treating me like invisible help wasn't sustainable, Joan told our group with satisfaction. Now I have weekly scheduled time with my grandson, plus genuine inclusion in family events. All it took was refusing to be taken for granted. These stories reinforce the central lesson I've learned. We teach people how to treat us through what we're willing to accept. Change the acceptance, change the treatment. David has become an unexpected advocate for this message among his male friends and colleagues. He speaks openly about how his people-pleasing tendencies nearly cost him his relationship with his mother, and how learning to establish boundaries actually improved all his relationships, not just ours. I thought keeping everyone happy meant avoiding difficult conversations, he told a men's group recently. But what I was really doing was teaching people that they could treat others poorly without consequences, as long as they kept me comfortable. That's not kindness. That's enabling dysfunction. His insights have helped other men recognize similar patterns in their own families. Robert, one of David's friends, realized he'd been allowing his wife to systematically exclude his elderly father from family gatherings because it was easier than dealing with her objections to his father's political opinions. After David's encouragement, Robert established clear expectations. His father would be included in family events, and if his wife couldn't manage basic politeness during these occasions, they would need to reconsider their approach to family relationships. "My father isn't perfect," Robert acknowledged, "but he raised me, supported me, and deserves basic respect from my family. My wife can disagree with his politics without." The results were immediate and positive. Robert's wife, faced with clear consequences for her behavior, learned to engage civilly with her father-in-law during family events. Robert's father, feeling valued and included, became more thoughtful about expressing controversial opinions around family members who might be sensitive to them. The whole family dynamic improved when everyone understood the expectations. Emma, now 3.5, has become the ultimate beneficiary of our family's commitment to respect and inclusion. She moves confidently between Charlotte's structured, elegant household and our more relaxed, hands-on environment, absorbing the best of both approaches to life. She's learning that families can look different and still be loving, that adults sometimes disagree but can still treat each other with kindness, and that her worth isn't dependent on being perfect or fitting someone else's expectations. Most importantly, she's growing up with a clear understanding that love is demonstrated through actions, not just words. She knows that Grandma Grace is someone she can count on, not just for gifts and treats, but for consistent presence, genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings, and unconditional acceptance of who she is. This foundation will serve her well throughout her life. She'll never accept poor treatment in romantic relationships because she's seen what healthy family relationships look like. She'll understand that respect is non-negotiable in all her connections with others, and she'll have the confidence that comes from knowing she's valued for who she is, not what she can provide for others. Charlotte, perhaps surprisingly, has undergone the most significant transformation of all of us. The financial incentives initially forced her to tolerate my presence, but over time she's begun to genuinely appreciate the practical and emotional support that comes from having an extended family network. When Emma went through a difficult phase of separation anxiety last year, Charlotte found herself relying on my experience and perspective in ways she never had before. When Emma would only calm down for me during one particularly challenging week, Charlotte swallowed her pride and asked for my help directly. "I don't understand why she responds so differently to you," Charlotte admitted during one of our difficult evenings together. "Children can sense authenticity," I explained gently. "Emma knows that I love her unconditionally, without any agenda or expectations beyond wanting her to be happy and healthy. That kind of acceptance is very calming for small people who are trying to figure out their place in the world." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose I've been so focused on making sure she develops properly, follows the right milestones, presents well to other people, that I haven't spent enough time just enjoying her." It was a breakthrough moment of self-awareness that led to Charlotte loosening some of her rigid expectations for Emma's behavior and development. The result has been a happier, more relaxed little girl and a more confident mother, who doesn't feel the need to control every aspect of her daughter's experience. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they required patience and consistency from all of us. But they prove that people can grow and change when they're given clear feedback about how their behavior affects others, combined with genuine consequences for poor choices and rewards for good ones. As I look toward the future, I feel optimistic about our family's trajectory in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark months of exclusion and hurt. Emma will grow up knowing all her family members, understanding that differences in opinion or lifestyle don't have to mean rejection or disrespect. David has learned to balance loyalty to his wife with respect for his mother, creating space for both relationships to flourish. And Charlotte has discovered that expanding her definition of family actually enriches Emma's life rather than diminishing it. But beyond our own family's healing, I'm proud of the broader conversation our story has helped to start. Too many families suffer in silence with similar dynamics, believing that poor treatment is just something they have to accept because that's how family works. Our experience proves that families can work better when everyone's dignity is protected and everyone's contributions are valued. If you've stayed with our story this long, chances are you see something of your own family dynamics reflected in our experience. Maybe you're the one being excluded or dismissed. Maybe you're the one allowing poor treatment to continue because confrontation feels too difficult. Maybe you're the one whose behavior needs to change. Regardless of which position you're in, remember this: healthy families aren't perfect families. They're families where problems are addressed honestly, where respect flows in all directions, and where love is demonstrated through consistent, caring actions rather than just claimed through words. You deserve to be treated with dignity by the people who claim to love you. Your children deserve to see examples of healthy relationships where boundaries are respected and kindness is reciprocated. And the people who are treating you poorly deserve the opportunity to become better versions of themselves through clear feedback and appropriate consequences. Change is possible, but it starts with one person deciding they deserve better and having the courage to insist on it. In our case, that person was me. In your family, it might need to be you. The transformation won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But it will be worth it. For you, for your children, and for the generations that follow who will learn from your example that love and respect aren't mutually exclusive. They're inseparable. 3 years ago, Charlotte told me I was too old and wrinkled for their family photos. Today, Emma insists that I sit right next to her in every picture we take, usually while wearing a dirt-stained gardening apron and with my hair messed up from our outdoor adventures. These photos aren't perfect, but they're honest. They show a family that has learned to value substance over surface, relationship over image, and love over control. And Emma? She thinks these imperfect, authentic pictures are the most beautiful ones we have. She's right. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If our story has resonated with you, I hope you'll share it with others who might need to hear that change is possible. Dignity is non-negotiable, and families can heal when everyone commits to treating each other with the respect that love deserves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.